Yeah, today I'm talking about on-chain games and starting with the experience, like what kind of, what problems are we trying to solve with on-chain games? What kind of new experience we're trying to create? I think a lot of people start with the tech and like say why it's interesting, but I don't think it touches the point. Basically we think there's like a couple of new design directions that have opened up because of fully on-chain games, and we need to be really specific. And then in order to support these design paradigms, then there's the tech, right? Then we need to build certain infra for it, and I'll talk briefly about what those are. So first, take some moment to think about this question, right? What makes the real world feel real? And obviously there's a rendering quality, which hasn't been matched by even Apple Vision Pro, I'm guessing. But there's another element, right, which is the social interactions. Humans are social animals from the beginning, and we have all kinds of relations and promises and deals with other people that are simply not matched in today's games. Why is that, right? So I basically, this is StarCraft. It's what we call social 1.0 games where the relations are PvP. There's nothing, there's no cooperation pretty much. Everything's competition. And CSGO and PUBG and a lot of these games are of this genre. And then the second stage of online social games, social 2.0, are most MMOs. This one's Rise of Kingdoms. And in there, you not only have PvP, but you have group versus group, what I call GVG. And the added dimension there is cooperation within a set, like a game-defined relation, right? Which is like a guild or alliance or whatever. But there's still a lot of problems. The social relation still is nowhere matched to the real world, because you can't really have point-to-point, like specific agreements with other people that gets enforced, right? Which is what the real world has. And for example, like if two guild leaders want to sign a peace treaty, they can't. Nobody will enforce that. If one player wants to trade with another player in a guild, they also can't. The only action in the game is to try to grind as hard as possible, or to put in as much, to whale as much as possible, which is like fine for the game, but we haven't seen an alternative where this doesn't have to be the case, right? And like, to be honest, right, the social relations make the real world very interesting. So what's missing, right? And the two pieces that's missing, one is the existence of highly valuable assets that didn't exist before blockchains. And there's the real world also has an effective law enforcement mechanism, where a lot of the promises that people make, whether it's between companies or between individuals, gets actually enforced, even if it's not every single time. There's this like kind of existence that makes people stick to their promises most of the time, right? Which does not exist in virtual worlds. And we already figured out half of the puzzle, which is digital assets, but what will be the other half, right? And you kind of know the answer already, which is treaties. So imagine this scenario where, like a strategy game, you're playing with Vitalik, and you have a third player, Justin Sun, that's like much bigger than both of you, and you guys want to stop fighting for a bit, right? Your experience with treaty making, and what's the ideal scenario? In previous games, this obviously has no binding effect. If you want to attack Vitalik, you still can, and if enough people do it to this guy, like Vitalik, he will leave the game frustrated, right? But what will be the ideal scenario? It will be that the game engine hopefully understands what promises people are making with each other, right? And automatically executes that, just like in somewhat like the real world, if not better. And here, we think the ultimate stage of deal making in virtual worlds is using chat, right? And let's say with this chat, or in text or in Discord, the machine or like the game engine will just interpret that using LLM into something like treaty and gets executed, right? And that's something that's not that far away, right, with the advance in LLMs. But the first step is to actually have a language where the game engine can understand and execute things. And that's where treaty comes about. So, I'll skip a bunch of things. Basically, we think that treaty is the social building block of digital worlds. The examples. I think there can be much bigger examples than what we had in the January game, just because the game was shorter. You can have like a Saudi Arabia in game that has a lot of oil that launches a currency that's one-to-one backed with the oil and set to a certain schedule for DeFi, right? You can even have different governance organizations that have different ways of passing policies and including members, etc. And this is something that's uniquely suited for blockchains because smart contracts, in this case, are used for social contracts. Basically, like they're not just governing assets in the DeFi world and NFTs, but in a much more context-rich environment like games. And this is not possible before because even with Web 2.5 games, because even if you, let's say you're a game developer, you claim that your game is XYZ, there's not a real way for any players to trust that, even if you want them to trust you, right? Even if you open source your code, like they don't know that the code or the experience they're having on the front end actually matches the code that you open source, right? But on-chain, fully on-chain games where logic is on-chain uniquely solve that problem. And I think this is the point that a lot of people can't articulate, but it's actually something unique about fully on-chain games. And it's not really if you simply just want to build like an asset-based game, like that doesn't have to be fully on-chain, right? And this part, Victor. Yeah, so people made some memes. And yeah, so we are, basically since January treaty, we've improved a lot on the infra side as well as iterated on the game design. Like if I were to talk to you in January, I think we wouldn't be so sure that the kind of high stake PvP plus the treaty making, the social interactions, will be able to make social 3.0 games beyond today's MMOs. But today we're very sure. And so we're basically going all out, building the real game. It's going to be a war strategy game with high stakes. Kind of think of it like playing StarCraft with other people, but with high stakes, like from 1,000 to large amounts of money, right? If you're good, you can get income from that, right? Just like esports. In some ways, it's democratizing esports. And so now let's talk a bit about infra. Basically, so infra needs to be very first principled about on-chain games today because I think a lot of people are hyped about the infra, as I said, but it really doesn't, we haven't seen any games that really give people eureka moment. So what's missing, right? Currently, we already have the social composability and the trustlessness of having assets on-chain. But what we don't have is high performance, great graphics, slick UX, etc. So a lot of the fundamental problems of games, not even on-chain games, are like forgotten or ignored because people think, more constraints, the better, which is like, yeah, I don't buy that. So, Dark Forest and a lot of current on-chain games avoid that by having very long action loops. Sending energy rays in Dark Forest take 15 minutes to several hours, which doesn't work for most games that are popular. And yeah, this you already know. Yeah, so the problem today is complex game equals slow TPS. And even our January treaty game wasn't that complex, but still players had to wait often 15, 20 seconds for each move and attack. And that's fundamentally because you're using EVM, which is not made for games, but using the opcodes made for a decentralized general purpose computation for games, which is extremely inefficient. And on top of that, you don't have the game tick. So if you want to move from point A to point B, the intent, you cannot just express the intent, but you have to actually move take every micro step as a transaction, which basically repeats a lot of the computation of, let's say, permission checks, treaty checks, etc. Right? So the traditional game engines have that. They have some people call it the update loop. Basically, let's say the game state updates every 1/60th of a second. That gets people closer to their intent. And this doesn't exist in blockchains today. And on top of that, there's Solidity, which also adds a lot of performance bottlenecks, such as when stack too deep issues happen, you basically have to call getter functions more often than you need to. There's a lot of details. And also, it's just much slower than JavaScript, C# or Go, right, to implement a game. So because of that, all of these constraints, we basically didn't give up. We were not hey, on-chain games can just be forever slow, and that's OK. We're that's not. And therefore, we built a sovereign rollup-based on-chain game engine framework made specifically to 100x the performance on-chain games. Yeah, so the demo is here. Did you see the demo already?
Not yet.
Okay.
I saw the picture.
Yeah, so basically it's like everything here you see are Warcraft assets. And everything here, right, including the locations of the troops, the buildings, the trees, and the attacks and moves, everything happened on chain and like in real time.
Nice.
Yeah.
It looks like a mod in Warcraft, right? It looks like a mod, that you would have created yourselves.
Yeah.
On Warcraft 3.
Exactly. Yeah, it's kind of like, it feels more like Age of Empires, honestly, than Warcraft. But yeah, it's kind of like in between. But regardless, yeah, that's kind of it showcases the potential of this. And yeah, the features, basically it's a high-throughput ECS-based game engine. It supports most RTS-style games, like StarCraft even. Has fast game tick as well as enshrined indexer, adds like a lot of missing things that blockchain don't have. It supports historical state querying. So if you have a treaty that, let's say, looks at how, like, if you like accumulated 20 gold in the past 5 turns, then it gives you something. It's like a more historical query than the current state query, and that's needed for treaties. You also have, obviously, the EVM compatible, like it's EVM equivalent smart contract execution. So all the smart contracts still are written in Solidity by players or by the LLM eventually, and gets executed by the game engine. And finally, the game logic is written in Go, so much more resilient. Yeah, in terms of the infrastructure, essentially so this part is Keystone L2 sequencer, where there's 2 parts. On the left, there's EVM, which processes the smart contracts. And the only difference between this and our previous version is you would get and set states using custom stateful precompiles, which allows you to interoperate with the game engine, which is here. So this part is also written in Go that like basically lives. It's one code base. We just separate it into 2, so it makes more sense. But this part actually does like the updates and the like game state changes, right? And this part is like very similar almost to a traditional game backend. That's very powerful. We found basically a way to interoperate with these 2. The EVM would Merkleize the data, so it still has that. And the data of the game is settled to Celestia for data availability, and also to Ethereum or another L1 of the community's choice for payouts. And the entire game is run by one or multiple guardians, which belongs to a multisig. And anyone in the community or outside of the community can monitor the game's integrity during or after the game. And there will be a challenge period where there will be fraud proofs. And if the guardian acts maliciously, they can be voted out and a new one will be selected. So yeah, this is like we think like a really cool setup to power the next generation of on-chain games.
So you can vote afterwards, like there is like a governance over the guardians.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, like this we think is the kind of infrastructure that games like Ready Player One or truly socially multifaceted and like rich games will be built on. And it's very likely like on-chain games have a good shot at doing it. And then yeah, in terms of what we're building, improving Keystone for sure, like top priority, and building our flagship game so that people actually see what the potential of all of this is. It doesn't matter before a great game comes. And then ultimately, like there's so much design space that just opened and we can't explore it all. And so we want people to actually actively build on top of Keystone. And we are going, like, we're going to provide a lot of, like, a very high level of help in terms of art assets, capital, distribution, because building game is not easy. It's not just building smart contracts, DeFi and deploying it and billions of dollars come in, right? So that's also kind of in the roadmap. And more details will come next week about the fellowship. So yeah, that's everything.